Imagine an island bathed in sunlight, surrounded by turquoise waters, home to 9.6 million people. An island where, since the beginning of 2026, the streets have been gradually emptying. Traffic lights are going dark. Hospitals are running on minimal capacity. Buses have nearly stopped running. People are waiting in line, sometimes for hours, just to get a few liters of gasoline. That island is Cuba. What its population is living through right now is the result of an energy crisis of unprecedented scale in the island's recent history. To understand what is happening today, we need to go back a little in time. Not very far, just a few weeks, a few months. But also, for certain aspects, more than 60 years back. Because the crisis Cuba is going through today did not come out of nowhere. It is the product of a long crisis and a particular history, a particular geography, and political decisions that have been accumulating for decades. Let's start with the most recent facts. In January 2026, the United States effectively cut off oil deliveries to Cuba. Concretely, Washington signed a decree opening the door to punitive tariffs against any country that sells oil to the Cuban government. The result was immediate. Oil tankers stopped approaching the island's shores. Cuba, which needs approximately 100,000 barrels of oil per day to keep its economy functioning, and which only produces around 40,000 barrels on its own territory, suddenly found itself facing a massive energy deficit it simply cannot fill on its own. But why did this decision come at precisely this moment? To understand that, we need to talk about Venezuela. Since the early 2000s, Venezuela had been Cuba's main oil supplier. The two countries maintained close ties, built on economic and political exchanges. Venezuela sent crude oil to Cuba, and Cuba in return sent doctors, teachers, and technicians. It was a partnership that allowed Cuba to keep its power plants, transportation networks, and factories running. In January 2026, following the arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in the context of an American military operation, that flow stopped abruptly. Overnight, Cuba lost approximately 27,000 barrels of oil per day, roughly half of its energy deficit. And quickly, American pressure extended to all other potential suppliers. Mexico, which had become the island's second largest energy supplier, suspended its deliveries under pressure from Washington. Other countries that could have stepped in chose not to risk American economic sanctions. The result was that from January 9th, 2026 onward, no oil-carrying vessel officially entered Cuban ports for several weeks. This absence of oil had concrete, direct, immediate consequences on the daily lives of the island's inhabitants. Power outages became the new normal. In Havana, the capital, residents faced blackouts lasting more than 15 hours per day. In the provinces, outages could last more than a full day at a time. In March 2026, the national electricity grid collapsed 3 times within a few weeks, plunging the entire country into darkness. The country's 8 thermoelectric power plants, almost all built in the 1980s and the 1990s, are aging and in very poor condition. Without oil to fuel them, they simply cannot operate. Transportation has ground to a halt. Buses barely run. Taxi prices have multiplied, sometimes doubling, sometimes tripling, and according to some accounts collected on the ground, sometimes increasing by a factor of 10. For many Cubans, getting from one place to another has become a daily challenge. Bicycles and bicycle taxis have returned to the streets of Havana. People walk miles to get to work. For those who cannot afford private transportation prices, the equation is simple. They stay home. Hospitals have been severely impacted as well. Hospitals rely on medical equipment that runs on electricity. Incubators for newborns, ventilators, and operations in operating rooms all depend on a stable energy supply. According to available data, more than 100,000 people, including over 11,000 children, were waiting for surgical procedures in Cuban hospitals because of the energy crisis. Every year, 20,000 newborns require incubators or respiratory assistance. In this context, power outages are not merely an inconvenience. They can cost lives. Airlines massively suspended their flights to Cuba. Air Canada, Air Transat, WestJet, and later Air France all announced suspensions of their routes to the island, citing a shortage of jet fuel that prevented aircraft from refueling on the ground. Tourism, which had been one of the main sources of revenue for the Cuban economy, collapsed. Bed and breakfast owners, private restaurant operators, and tour guides all depended on foreign visitors and saw their income vanish overnight. In this sector, thousands of people were left without work and without resources. Food supply was also affected. Cuba imports approximately 80% of its food. Without fuel for trucks, ships, and supply chains, food products have difficulty reaching markets. Prices have skyrocketed. A black market for fuel, medicine, and basic necessities has grown rapidly. A liter of oil can fetch $5 on the black market, a significant sum in a country where wages remain very low. More than 96% of small and medium-sized private businesses reported severe to catastrophic impacts due to the fuel shortage. Independent workers and entrepreneurs, a sector that had been growing in recent years, are among the most vulnerable, since they do not benefit from state wage guarantees. Faced with this situation, the Cuban government implemented a series of emergency measures. The work week was reduced to 4 days. Remote work was rolled out across government agencies and state-owned companies. Fuel sales were strictly rationed. Some hotels temporarily closed to reduce energy consumption. University classes shifted to online formats. Government officials made regular appearances in the media to inform the population of decisions being taken and to try to maintain a sense of calm. Cuban Prime Minister Manuel Marrero declared that Cuba was not stopping and was not freezing, calling on institutions to strengthen their operations with measured decisions. These words aimed to reassure an exhausted population, a population that had already been living through very difficult economic conditions for several years. Because it must be said clearly, the current crisis did not emerge on a blank slate. It is embedded in a context of gradual deterioration that has been ongoing for years, worsened by the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, by several devastating hurricanes, and by a decades-long American economic embargo. The United States embargo against Cuba has been in place since 1962. It is the longest commercial embargo of the modern era. For more than 60 years, it has restricted trade, investment, and technology transfers between Cuba and the rest of the world. According to the Cuban government, it has cost the island's economy hundreds of billions of dollars. Those who support the embargo consider it a legitimate tool of pressure to push for political reforms. Those who oppose it argue that it primarily punishes ordinary people, without managing to change the political system. Under Barack Obama, a normalization process was initiated, starting in 2014, with the resumption of diplomatic relations and a loosening of certain restrictions. But this opening was progressively abandoned during Donald Trump's first term, which saw 240 new sanctions imposed on Cuba. Just days before the end of that first term, Trump had placed Cuba back on the American list of state sponsors of terrorism. Joe Biden then removed Cuba from that list in the final days of his presidency. In January 2025, Donald Trump, back in office, immediately reinstated it. In this context, the current crisis represents a significant intensification of a long-standing policy. Washington justified its decisions by declaring that Cuba represented an unusual and extraordinary threat to American national security, and by accusing the Cuban authorities of aligning with states considered hostile, such as Russia, China, and Iran. American officials indicated that the ultimate goal of these policies is to achieve political and economic liberalization in Cuba, including the removal of President Miguel Diaz-Canel from power. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, himself of Cuban descent, and a long-standing opponent of the Havana government, has been identified as one of the architects of this maximum pressure strategy. On the diplomatic front, the situation is complex. China expressed opposition to the American blockade and pledged to provide Cuba with as much support and assistance as possible. But in concrete terms, it has not yet delivered oil in a way that directly challenges the blockade. Its approach, according to analysts, remains essentially commercial. Russia, on the other hand, chose to act. In late March 2026, a Russian oil tanker, the Anatoly Kolodkin, carrying approximately 730,000 barrels of crude oil, docked at the port of Matanzas, east of Havana. It was the first oil cargo to arrive in Cuba since January 9th, a brief relief for the population, though experts estimated that the shipment could only cover Cuba's energy needs for about 9 to 10 days. The American decision to allow this tanker to dock, since Donald Trump publicly stated he saw no problem with Russia sending oil to Cuba, was interpreted by analysts as a political calculation aimed at avoiding a direct confrontation with Moscow while maintaining overall pressure on the island. Washington clarified that sanctions remained in place and that the Russian delivery was handled on a case-by-case basis. The reaction from the international community was broadly critical of American policy. The United Nations expressed serious concern. The United Nations coordinator on the ground, Francisco Pichon, stated from Havana that the risks to people's lives were not rhetorical. The United Nations human rights chief, Volker Turk, said he was extremely worried and called for the lifting of unilateral sectoral sanctions, highlighting their significant and indiscriminate impact on the population. The Director General of the World Health Organization also expressed concern about the health situation, calling for healthcare services to be insulated from energy blockades and geopolitics. Mexico, despite the suspension of its oil deliveries, sent more than 800 tons of humanitarian aid aboard 2 ships of its national navy, including basic food staples and hygiene products. Canada was urged by parliamentarians to provide assistance to Cuba. Several international humanitarian organizations mobilized to try to deliver medical supplies and food to the island. On the Cuban side, the population is divided in its response to the crisis. Testimonies collected on the island by foreign journalists reveal very different reactions. Some Cubans feel that the political system has run out of steam and hope for change. Others fear that outside intervention would only worsen the situation, pointing to the instability such interventions have produced in other countries in the region. What is certain is that despair has been spreading. Millions of Cubans ask themselves every day when the electricity will come back on, whether there will be enough food, whether their job will still be there tomorrow. Daily life has become, in the words of one Cuban interviewed by a Canadian newspaper, a continuous exercise in improvisation and survival. Bicycles replace cars, candles replace electricity, informal markets replace official supply channels. A quiet but real solidarity is forming between neighbors and between families to share available resources and face together conditions of life that have become considerably more difficult. In this context, Cuba is also trying to accelerate its energy transition. The country launched an ambitious plan in 2014 to develop renewable energies. In 2023, the share of renewables in its electricity mix was still around 4%, far from the stated objectives. But things are moving. In 2025, Cuba inaugurated its first large-scale photovoltaic power plant. According to data from the Latin American Energy Organization, published in September 2025, the share of renewables in national electricity production had reached 14%. The target for 2035 is to reach 37%. In the long term, a major development of solar energy could allow Cuba to reduce its dependence on oil imports and secure its energy supply in a more autonomous way. But in the short term, this transition cannot solve the immediate crisis. On the diplomatic front, negotiations are underway between Cuba and the United States. President Diaz-Canel publicly confirmed on March 13, 2026, that his country was in negotiations with Washington to find solutions to the differences between the two nations. Sources close to the discussions indicated that the Trump administration was pushing for Diaz-Canel to step down as a condition for any easing of pressure. The Cuban government rejected any idea of capitulation, and the deputy foreign minister stated that Cuba was preparing for possible forms of aggression, while affirming that the government did not wish to escalate its relationship with Washington. The outcome of this crisis remains uncertain. Nobody can predict with confidence how events will unfold in the coming weeks or months. What is clear is that the Cuban population is at the center of these geopolitical tensions, and that it is paying the price in its daily life. Regardless of where one stands on the policies of either side, one fact remains undeniable. Millions of ordinary people are living through increasingly difficult conditions, with direct consequences on their health, their nutrition, their safety, and their future. Cuba has faced many crises throughout its history. In the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the island went through what became known as the Special Period in Time of Peace, a major economic crisis during which the population had to adapt to shortages of all kinds. It survived that difficult period at great cost and through considerable sacrifice. Today, the challenges are once again immense. The question that presents itself, both to those observing from the outside and to those living through it on the inside, is a straightforward one. How will this crisis be resolved, and at what human cost? What is certain is that the stakes extend far beyond the island of Cuba itself. They touch on questions of national sovereignty, on the legitimacy of economic sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, on geopolitical balances in the Caribbean and across Latin America, and on the responsibility of the international community when humanitarian crises unfold. These are questions with no simple answers, and they deserve to be approached with all the rigor and nuance they require.